Imagine this, it's 1484. You're a commoner in one of England's market towns, maybe York, maybe Bristol, maybe even Canterbury. And a royal official arrives, unfurls a scroll, clears his throat and starts reading aloud. He reads that your queen, the woman who has been Queen of England for nearly 20 years, never really was your queen at all. That her marriage to King Edward IV was, and I'm quoting directly here, an ungracious feigned marriage. And the reason? Witchcraft. He reads that Elizabeth Woodville, alongside her own mother, Jacquetta, Duchess of Bedford, had used sorcery and witchcraft to bewitch the king into marrying her, that the marriage was void, that her children were bastards, and that therefore the rightful King of England was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, King Richard III. This wasn't whispered gossip. This was a rumour floating around the court. This was an act of parliament. It was read aloud across the entire realm, designed to reshape what ordinary English people believed about their former queen and her children. And here's the thing, and this is what I want you to hold on to for this entire video. There was no new evidence. Not a single fresh witness, no trial, no investigation. Richard III had simply taken an old, already discredited accusation and dressed it up in legal language and wielded it like a weapon. Ricardians, don't come for me, because you will lose worse than Richard at the Battle of Bosworth. Boom! Welcome to Hannah's Royal Mysteries. Today we're asking, were these queens and duchesses really witches? Or were they just women standing in the way of very powerful men? To understand 1484, we need to go back 15 years. Because this story actually begins not with Elizabeth Woodville, but with her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. She was extraordinary by the standards of medieval aristocracy. She was born into one of Europe's most prestigious noble families, became the Duchess of Bedford through her first marriage, and after her first husband's death, she made the deeply scandalous decision to secretly remarry. For love, apparently, a relatively minor knight named Richard Woodville. When her daughter, Elizabeth, then secretly married King Edward IV, another love match, another scandal, Jacquetta went from minor knight's wife to mother of the Queen of England pretty much overnight. The Woodvilles rose spectacularly fast, and fast rises at court tend to breed resentment. And resentment in the medieval world had a very specific shape. In 1469, the powerful Earl of Warwick, who had practically put Edward IV on the throne and was furious about losing influence, launched a rebellion against the king. And in the middle of all this political upheaval, one of Warwick's followers, a man named Thomas Wake, produced a very specific piece of evidence against Jacquetta: a lead figurine. Thomas Wake accused Jacquetta of making lead figurines, like a man of arms, broken in the middle and made fast with a wire, to use in witchcraft against the king's family. The figurine was physically produced at Warwick Castle as supposed proof. A small lead figure broken in the middle and wired back together. Wake claimed Jacquetta had made it and that it was a tool of witchcraft used to harm the royal family through dark magic. Now, context is everything here. This accusation lands right in the middle of a rebellion. Warwick is trying to destroy Edward IV's power base, and one of the most effective ways to do it was to destroy the Woodvilles, the family everyone at court already hates. Targeting Jacquetta isn't about targeting Jacquetta, it's about delegitimising her daughter, the Queen, and then by extension the King's judgment in marrying her. But here's what makes this case so interesting. Jacquetta fought back. When Edward IV regained control and Warwick's rebellion collapsed, she took her case directly to the King's Great Council. She didn't hide, she didn't flee. She stood before the council and described Wake's accusation as coming from his own malicious intentions, designed to destroy her reputation and her person. And it worked. The case collapsed, Jacquetta was formally cleared in January 1470, and Wake couldn't make the charges stick. But, and this is the part that should send a chill down your spine, the story didn't end there. Because 14 years later, when Richard III needed to unqueen Elizabeth Woodville and make her children illegitimate, he didn't need new evidence. He just needed to resurrect the old accusation, the one that had already been dismissed, the one that Jacquetta herself had fought and won. The same accusation was resurrected posthumously in the Titulus Regius, when it became politically useful to discredit her daughter and her grandchildren. Jacquetta had died in 1472, 12 years before the Act was passed, so she couldn't defend herself. She couldn't stand before any council. Richard took a discredited, collapsed case against a dead woman and built a crown on top of it. I mean, if that doesn't tell you something about how witchcraft accusations worked in medieval court, I don't really know what will, to be honest. Before we go any further, I think we need to pause and ask an important question. Because if we're going to understand why witchcraft accusations landed the way they did, why they were believable, why they were useful, then we need to understand what ordinary medieval people actually thought about magic. And the honest answer might actually surprise you. Magic wasn't fringe. It wasn't the cackling woman in the forest or sinister outsiders. Magic was actually woven into the fabric of everyday medieval life, including, crucially, medicine, religion, and court culture. Medicine in medieval England blended religious, supernatural, and rational elements. The church oversaw much of the medicine, but charms, relics, and prayers were pretty much standard tools. Think about what a visit to a medieval physician looked like. Yes, there might be some herbal remedies, some of which actually worked, by the way, but there would also very likely be prayers, religious charms, perhaps a relic of a saint. The line between spiritual healing and what we might call magic was genuinely a bit blurry, and the church itself was responsible for a huge amount of it. And then there's astrology. Astrology was a mainstream diagnostic tool. Physicians cast horoscopes using star charts to judge when a patient fell ill and when treatments would work. Learned medical writers in late medieval England routinely incorporated astrology and folk remedies into their practice. This was the norm. It wasn't deviant occultism. We're talking about physicians, like university-educated, formally trained medical men, consulting star charts as part of their standard diagnostic process. Astrology wasn't a sign that someone was dabbling in forbidden arts. It was just medicine. It was just how you practiced healing. A noblewoman using an astrologer, wearing an amulet or seeking out fertility potions wasn't automatically a witch. These were normal, ordinary things. Until, of course, someone needed her to be a witch. That's the crucial shift. The same practices that were entirely unremarkable when associated with a politically safe woman became sinister and criminal when attached to a woman at the centre of a power struggle. And the magic didn't change. It was the politics that did. And this is something I want you to keep in mind as we look at our next case. Now, the Woodvilles weren't the first noblewomen to have witchcraft weaponised against them. Not by a long shot. 40 years before the Titulus Regius, in 1441, another highborn woman found herself at the centre of a very similar accusation. Her name was Eleanor Cobham, and she was the Duchess of Gloucester. Eleanor's husband, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was the uncle of King Henry VI, and since Henry was young and had no children, he was also heir presumptive to that throne. This made Humphrey extraordinarily powerful, and powerful men at court had correspondingly powerful enemies. Chief among them was Cardinal Henry Beaufort, who had been locked in a factional struggle with Humphrey for years. And in 1441, Eleanor Cobham suddenly found herself accused of sorcery, necromancy, and using astrology to forecast. And this was the really dangerous part: the king's death. The trigger was a political struggle. Cardinal Henry Beaufort and other rivals wanted to break Humphrey's power, and targeting his wife was an effective way to ruin him. Now, let's be clear about what this meant in practical terms. Predicting when a king might die, whether by astrology or any other means, was considered a form of treason. It implied you might be planning for that death. It implied, potentially, that you were trying to bring about that death. Eleanor admitted to one thing: she had sought out fertility potions. She wanted children. She had asked for help with that. And that was the extent of what she had acknowledged. Eleanor admitted only to ordering fertility potions, but her associates, astrologer Roger Bolingbroke, physician Thomas Southwell, and wise woman Marjorie Jourdemain were executed, while she was publicly shamed and imprisoned for life. Can we just think about that? She wanted to conceive a child, so she sought help from an astrologer, a physician, and a woman known for her knowledge of herbs and remedies. Exactly the kind of people you would consult in medieval England if you were struggling with fertility. Completely normal. And yet the same people she turned to for help were executed. Eleanor herself was not executed, but what happened to her was arguably worse in some ways. She was forced to perform a public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of London carrying a wax candle, her shame displayed for the entire city to witness. 3 times on 3 separate days, and then she was imprisoned for the rest of her life. Now, if this sounds remotely similar to you, that is because Eleanor's penance was the inspiration for Cersei Lannister's Walk of Shame in Game of Thrones. Obviously, George R.R. Martin just took a little bit of creative license and kind of nudged it up a little bit. And what happened to Humphrey? He was politically destroyed. He was arrested on charges of treason, charges many historians believe were also fabricated, and died in custody in 1447, probably of a stroke brought on by the shock of his arrest. Targeting Eleanor Cobham didn't just ruin Eleanor, it ruined Humphrey, which was, of course, the point. The pattern is unmistakable once you see it. A powerful man has enemies. Those enemies cannot easily get to the man directly, so they go after the woman beside him. They reach for the most reliable weapon available, the accusation of witchcraft. Now, I want to address something that might be in the back of your mind because it is a fair question. When most people hear the words witch trial, they think of a very specific image. Mass hysteria, rural villages, women dragged from their homes and hanged or burned, the Salem witch trials, the Pendle witches, Matthew Hopkins stalking through East Anglia. You know, that kind of thing. So how do the cases we've been talking about today, Eleanor Cobham, Jacquetta and Elizabeth Woodville, fit into that picture? Are these the same phenomenon? Are they related? Or is it simply quite different? Well, the answer, I think, is that these are genuinely just different animals, and the differences are really instructive. Let's start with who was being accused. Medieval court cases mostly targeted high-status women tied to the powerful men or dynastic claims. The 16th and 17th century hunts largely targeted commoners, often marginalising women in rural communities. Eleanor Cobham was a duchess. Jacquetta was a duchess. Elizabeth Woodville was a queen. These are not marginalised women on the edges of society. These are women at the very centre of power, and that's precisely why they were targeted. Their political proximity to powerful men made them very useful targets. In the later witch hunts, the profile is almost the complete opposite. We're looking at women who were already vulnerable, already on the margins, already subjects of community suspicion and fear. Then there's the arena where these accusations played out. Medieval elite cases were tried in high political contexts, royal council, parliament, with dynastic stakes. Early modern mass trials took place in local and regional courts, with dozens potentially executed in a single episode. Parliament, the King's Council, these are the venues for the medieval cases. The accusation of witchcraft in these contexts is intertwined with treason, legitimacy and succession. It's a legal and political instrument aimed at specific targets with specific goals. The later hunts was something completely different. They were driven by community dynamics, local feuds, theological panic, the spread of demonological ideas that cast witchcraft as a vessel for satanic conspiracy. King James I of England wrote an entire book on the subject called Demonology. His 1604 Witchcraft Act created a broader legal framework that just made it far easier to prosecute and execute people for magic. And the outcomes tell you everything. Medieval noblewomen were often imprisoned, disgraced, or politically neutralised, their reputations blackened, but the cases obviously entangled with factional struggles. Later accused were far more likely to be executed as examples to the community. Eleanor Cobham was imprisoned for life. Jacquetta was cleared completely. Elizabeth Woodville was stripped of queenship through parliamentary rhetoric. Her children declared illegitimate, but not charged with a crime herself. The goal of these medieval accusations was rarely the woman herself. It was what destroying her could achieve. It was about clearing a path to the throne, breaking a rival's power, delegitimising inconvenient heirs. In the later witch hunts, the women were the point. Their deaths were the point. That's a profound and very disturbing difference. What the medieval court cases and later witch hunts do share is this. Both reveal how quickly witch became a go-to label for women who were, for one reason or another, inconvenient. The mechanism was different, the scale was different, but the underlying logic that a woman's power or connection to power could be neutralised by calling her a witch, well, that logic runs through all of it. So let's just come back to where we started. 1484, an official reading Titulus Regius allowed across England, telling the people that their queen had bewitched their king. Were Elizabeth Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg witches? There's no evidence that they were. The only evidence that ever existed was a lead figurine produced during a rebellion by a man with an obvious political motive, in a case that was heard by the King's Council and thrown out. Jacquetta was formally cleared, the charges collapsed, and when King Richard III needed to use them again 14 years later, Richard provided no fresh evidence. He leaned on existing rumours and Jacquetta's old collapsed case, suggesting the charge was a rhetorical weapon, not a serious investigation. Was Eleanor Cobham a witch? She used astrology and sought fertility remedies, both things that were entirely ordinary in her time and place. The people around her were executed for it. She was imprisoned for life, and her husband, the man whose power her enemies actually wanted to break, was destroyed alongside her. What strikes me most about all these cases is not the witchcraft. It's the precision. These weren't panics. These weren't communities swept up in fear. These were calculated strikes aimed at specific women designed to achieve specific political outcomes. Richard III needed to invalidate a marriage. Cardinal Beaufort needed to destroy Humphrey of Gloucester. The Earl of Warwick needed to delegitimise the Woodvilles. And, in each case, witchcraft was the instrument that they reached for. But then, why? Because it was perfect. It was unprovable either way. You can't definitively show that magic didn't happen. It tapped into existing anxieties about women, power, and the supernatural. It had theological weight, making the accused not just politically dangerous, but morally corrupted in the eyes of God. And, crucially, it put the accused on the defensive. I mean, how do you prove you're not a witch? These women, Elizabeth, Jacquetta, Eleanor, were not marginal figures. They were not the vulnerable, isolated women who became the primary victims of the later witch hunts. They were women of enormous status and proximity to power. And it was precisely that power, or their connections to it, that made them targets. The witchcraft label was a precision weapon, and history, when it looks closely, can usually see the hand that aimed it. So were they women, or were they just women standing in the way of men who wanted what they had? That I'll let you decide. If you found this video interesting, then please do hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. There are so many more stories like this one buried in medieval history, and trust me, we're just getting started. Leave me a comment below and let me know which royal mystery do you want me to dig into next. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye!